Can I get a business account that is tailor-made for my business?
Can I accept payments easily?
Can I manage and personalize my business account as my business grows?
Can I do my business banking any time of the day, wherever I am?
Can I make more money off my business's money? With Absa, I can.
Open a Business Evolve account online and get all this plus free cash flow manager, an integrated accounting tool. We do more so you can. That's Africanacity.
Yeah, good morning and welcome everyone to our very exciting panel that we have today. My name is Liesl Cassia and I've been asked to moderate this session. I work for TWIMS, which stands for Toyota Vessels Institute for Manufacturing Studies, and we've been set up as an institute to promote manufacturing in the country. And we run a GIBS manufacturing focused MBA, and we're involved in various research projects related to manufacturing. And we've kind of been given birth to by Toyota, who kind of saw the need for manufacturing as a critical sector in Africa and in South Africa. So we've got an African and South African mandate. I'm really excited to be leading this panel today, which is really focused on manufacturing and in particular, what are the key financing trends that we are seeing in manufacturing and what financial instruments are available for manufacturers to take their operations to the next level. And we all kind of know that if we look at economic data, that all the countries that have achieved a significant economic growth have done so off the back of a really strong manufacturing sector. So it's a critical sector that we need in terms of our economy. And in South Africa, the data kind of suggests that it's actually a sector that's been in decline. So we really need to look at innovative ways in which we can stimulate manufacturing in South Africa and Africa, and potentially finance is the tool that we could use to unlock some of those opportunities. So this morning I have an esteemed panel with me, and we're going to be asking them some tough questions and hopefully get some rigorous discussion and debate going. So we have Justin Schmidt joining us, who is from Absa. He is the head of new sector development, and he brings with him 15 years experience, and manufacturing is one of his key sectors that he's responsible for. So we welcome Justin, and we'll hear from him a bit later. Then we also have Sindiso Ndlovu joining us, who's from the ECIC, and she too has extensive experience in manufacturing and particularly relating to exports, and is looking at trade and investment opportunities in the continent. So we welcome Sindiso. Then we also have Mosela Nhlapo joining us, who is the CEO of the African Rail Industry Association. And we look forward to hearing her views, particularly around Africa and infrastructure, and what are the opportunities to kind of grow manufacturing through the infrastructure sector. So we welcome Mosela. And then finally, we've got Melisha Pillay joining us, who's from the NCPC, which is the implementation arm of the CSRR. And they really work with industry around creating efficiencies, particularly around energy and sustainability. And she is going to bring kind of a viewpoint around the new green financing opportunities for industry, and how do we take the sustainability field and merge it with finance to unlock some opportunities for manufacturers. So to kind of get the discussion going, maybe I'd start off with Justin and ask you, from your experience, what are the kind of key financial solutions that are available to manufacturers, and how should manufacturers be kind of approaching finance to grow and expand their business?
Thanks, Liesl. So we look at it kind of in terms of short-term finance and then longer term. Short-term being core to a manufacturer's needs, that we know that they buy the raw material, they might be importing that, they sit on it for quite a long time, whether it's a steel manufacturer that might sit on that stock for 90 days, or a food and beverage manufacturer that might sit on it for 30 days. Their different cycles are core to kind of how we solution them. They then kind of make the sale and wait for that money to come in. So core to the manufacturing view in terms of finance for us is that you need to understand those cash conversion cycles, how long it takes to convert inventory into sales. And then is there a funding need based on that? I think, so that's number one. And knowing that that's not really a security kind of lending game, it's short-term assets. You've really got to understand kind of how they lock up that inventory. And we've also seen through these cycles, everyone knows about the shipping issues, the raw material shortages globally. And that's impacted manufacturers massively, where a lot of our clients are stocking up, which means working capital is tied up. So I think in terms of access to finance, understanding all of that is key, and understanding that there might be a funding need and it goes through seasonal fluctuations. I think that's the starting point for us with manufacturers. And then understanding the finance needs in terms of staying competitive, in terms of the decline you spoke about. If you want to stay competitive as a manufacturer, it's key for us as a bank to understand that you have to reinvest. So if you're investing in machinery, to understand that someone that's importing that machinery, from global manufacturing companies, it puts them at an advantage, and by continuously reinvesting into your business, it allows you to compete globally. So for us, that's the second key pillar, looking at the strategy and the long-term assets of manufacturers, and just knowing that, if they're not reinvesting and we're not taking a view of how that energy efficiency supports their competitiveness, things like investing into solar for their own energy cost and reducing that, and taking a much more cash flow type lending view. I think that's key to me as a financier and key to our strategy in the space.
Okay, and just maybe a follow-up question around that is particularly around firm size. What kind of firm size do you normally deal with, and are there kind of nuanced finance products for different firm sizes?
So in our world, we are not part of the investment bank is kind of a different arm to the business, corporate investment bank, and that's more your listed entities, your multinationals. Where we come in as businesses, say $1 billion down in terms of business, up to 400 million lending, but further down to the SMEs as well. The skew in our book is towards the commercial type of business, so more of your 100 million to 300 to 500 million businesses. And there are thousands of those clients out there. So we do have volumes of clients in this space. So that's kind of the firm sizes, but very much the needs are always, they might not own their business yet, their buildings yet, but it is kind of, they need the working capital, they need the machinery. But it is skewed more away from the SMEs compared to if we look at our other sector focuses like retail. You would see a lot more SME businesses there. And I think that just talks to, manufacturing is a complex business, big employment driver. And and I think there's a nice kind of sweet spot of businesses that, aren't household names that you can deal with. I think what's also important is the subsectors within it. A lot of these value chains, we see a lot of steel manufacturers in our books through that value chain. Although that industry struggled, there's a lot of good businesses out there downstream. that industry, a lot of food and beverage manufacturers as well. And interestingly, we've seen quite a nice resurgence in textiles. Then a lot of the value chains, that there's a lot of good opportunities there with local businesses kind of building locally manufactured goods.
Okay, thanks, Justin. I think that's been quite valuable, and I think it's quite interesting to hear the sector breakdowns. And I think it's really interesting that you're kind of seeing a resurgence of textiles, which is quite interesting given the kind of global context that we are situated in. Before I move on, I just wanted to maybe ask a question around. You mentioned a lot around inventory supply and kind of firms stocking up. Do you think COVID has changed the model in which manufacturers are operating? So I know there's been a lot of kind of supply chain disruptions and, the questioning of the just-in-time kind of production mechanisms when you're kind of waiting a long time for parts now. Do you have any comments on that before I move on to Sindiso?
So we sponsor the BER manufacturing survey. So fortunately, we get to look into the detail and look at kind of the confidence of subsectors, as well as look at the ABSA PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, every month. And so we started seeing this raw material shortage over 12 months ago and been tracking it. What's interesting is it has subsided somewhat, but what we did see throughout the cycle is as this started happening, number one, some raw materials started getting imported globally just to stock up purely. So I think a lot of manufacturers were saying, if I can't get it locally, I need to have the raw materials in stock up because otherwise I'm going to lose sales. That's not necessarily a long-term trend, but it did open up kind of supplier bases and people looking at, can I import some of my raw materials? But what was also interesting then is we have some clients that would just export the byproducts, some of their byproducts, some in the textiles industry actually, and they saw that because these supply chains were shut down, what they were exporting is more valuable if they repurpose it and manufacture. So they do hides as one example of this client, and they decided that actually what they'll do is make safety boots and other kind of textiles products, and they make more off that good than exporting it. But previously it was a bit of a headache for them to export and to manufacture, and they could just export that second grade byproduct and just look at the A grade raw material. So we've seen some of those examples. Anecdotes. We've seen a lot of those anecdotes within our client base where they're saying, well, I'm exporting something that maybe I can make more value here. And like I said as well, the shutting down of other markets allowed the kind of local base to operate. And then what was also interesting, even in the food sector, some clients that are importing goods, because of these issues, they've looked at developing local supply chains and local markets. And so do you think it got everyone to reflect and say, what can I get locally? Where can I look at local kind of primary producers of my product, and then beneficiate it and not wait for things on a ship to come in?
Great, thank you. Maybe Sindiso, this would be a good point for you to come in. I think Justin's spoken about around exports, and maybe just your view on in the work that you're doing. Do you think there's a match between what the manufacturing firms need in terms of finance and what's being offered, and maybe just some commentary around what you're seeing in the work that you're doing with firms in the export space?
Thank you, Liesl. I think ECIC has generally been in the medium to long-term space, and our mandate was very strict as we were not allowed to compete with the private insurance market in South Africa. So we're very excited that now we can cover short to medium transactions. And, some people might ask, but why that space in particular? We have seen a withdrawal or reduced capacity in some of the countries that the short-term insurance private market could cover outside the continent, because we strictly focus on exports. So ECIC has obviously started engaging with various commercial banks as well as DFIs in South Africa, just to see how we can assist, manufacturers, particularly in the sectors that are included in the DTIC master plan. When we're in the medium to long term, I think our expertise was generally around project finance, construction, and infrastructure development, which included hospitals. But now we're moving closer to home, to where there is a need. As you have mentioned, I think manufacturing has been on the decline. So the African Continental Free Trade Area actually presents an opportunity. So as the ECIC, we do not fund, we insure. So we work extensively with banks. And as Justin has mentioned, obviously when you have working capital, security requirements can be higher. And that is where ECIC actually comes in that particular space. So we are hoping to partner extensively. I think we've started doing, obviously market sounding, just to discuss with the various banks to see if we can even offer umbrella facilities. So I think my word of encouragement will be, given that the credit risk assessment will still have to be done by the bank, we would actually encourage our SMEs to make sure that they have, solid banking relationships, that they also have good financial and demonstrated technical capability, because we also place quite a lot of the reliance in terms of our risk assessment processes on what the bank has done, so that we can offer, balance sheet relief to some of the banks. But we're purely looking at those manufacturers that are interested in exporting, obviously, outside the country. So I think the African Continental Free Trade Area, as well as support of the different master plans, would obviously give our manufacturers an opportunity. I think we can acknowledge that South Africa, and not just South Africa, but Southern Africa has been growing slower than the rest of the continent. So here we are with markets that are outside, and are our manufacturers ready to take advantage of those opportunities that have come with that. So I think from my side, it will also be very, very exciting to hear from Alicia, as well as, the transport industry, to see how we're supporting our manufacturing sector, particularly in enabling them to be able to export. Thank you very much, Lizzo.
Thanks, Sandiso. Just maybe a follow-up question to that. What are you kind of seeing in the trends in terms of the sectors that you are working with? Are there any kind of sectors that are progressing well in the export space, or are kind of dominating that space? And if you are a new SMME wanting to kind of break into the exports markets, how do they kind of go about engaging with yourselves and kind of hedging some of their risk to make them more fundable from the likes of Justin and Co?
Okay, I think from our side as ECIC, as I mentioned, this is a relatively new space to us. This has never been our forte before. So I think much of our reliance is actually being guided by the DTIC master plans. Some of the sectors that we're prioritizing at the moment are obviously the automotives, because that's much closer in terms of what ECIC has been doing in the medium to long-term space. We are also seeing some potential, obviously upstream in the steel sector, and we're engaging extensively with the plastic sector, that has been sharing in terms of what they can do. So at the present moment, those are the sectors from the master plan that we have chosen to prioritize, but this does not restrict who we can potentially work with. I think obviously in the medium to long term, that will be different, but given that this focus is purely for SMEs, I think it's best for me to say we will align with the sectors, because at the moment we do not do any direct funding as the ECIC. We work and collaborate with the commercial banks. So I think we'll be taking, guidance from there so that we're able to support those manufacturers that are looking at working capital, as well as those that are considering, advanced payment bonds. In the past, I think we have worked extensively with the boat building industry. We're still seeing a bit of traction there. There has been some slow movement in the past year or so due to a number of various challenges that the sector was facing, but there is a little bit of traction as well from our side that we're picking up, particularly in the boat building industry, which is one of the sectors that we have been supporting. And as the ECIC, we continue to require South African content. I think Justin mentioned the fact that there has been frustration, there has been, shortages of various raw materials. So as the ECIC, we still, insist on supporting transactions where there is, SA content, so that we can assist our manufacturers, and we're not just looking at middlemen that are purchasing and selling, but, industries or SMEs that are adding value in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Sandiso. So maybe now we'll move on to Misela, who could maybe give us a bit more of a African continental kind of viewpoint on finance. And maybe the question to you would be, from the kind of rail and infrastructure space, what are you kind of seeing are the key factors that are influencing access to finance, and where do you kind of see the opportunities coming from, particularly around infrastructure and the link to manufacturers? If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would. Sorry, I would like to, park your question on the side and maybe give a little bit of background on where the sector is and where the sector is going. So as an industry body, our goals is, one, to revitalize the sector, two, to transform the sector and advocate for any policy that actually supports our vision. And our vision is actually aligned with the African Union, where we want to see infrastructure, rail infrastructure that crisscrosses the continent in terms of supporting that intra-Africa trade that we need very, very, very much. And in order for Africa to develop, economically develop, we rely on those policies. We would like to talk about finance right at the end, but where is the market of the railway sector? Who are the participants? Do we have money? Do we have an environment that makes it attractive for Justin to invest in the sector? So we, as South Africa, we have over, say, 80% of the rail infrastructure on the continent. We have over 36,000 of kilometers track in South Africa, where a little bit of that is PRASA managed, and then the majority is managed by Transnet. When the president announced the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan with regard to third-party access, as an organization, we were excited and we formed a board committee that will lead a project of practical implementation of third-party access. Now, that committee then led to different work streams, including funding, and we're actually working with some of your colleagues at ABSA, which include legal and regulatory. Our legal counsel is Weber Wenzel. We're looking at the commercial aspects as well. Then there is stakeholder engagement, that we educate the public. But out of these subcommittees, and our research is that there are certain lines within the Transnet network which are not being utilized. For instance, your general freight business has been largely not being say attended to or been provided services by the likes of Transnet. So there is over 80% usage or underutilized asset that we have from the state. And then this is where third-party access would come in. Now, then, and over then to the operators that will benefit from third-party access. They will then have customers upstream and downstream, the mining industry, the agri space, the timber space. So that will create a demand for the operators. Now, once an operator has a contract with an Exxaro, for instance, then there will be a need for about, we estimate at the moment about 45 billion rand in terms of rolling stock manufacturing. Then it feeds into the manufacturing sector. So, and then this is where you find your SMMEs that will then contribute into the bigger picture and ensure that we have sustainable jobs. Now, on the financing side, and how do we create an environment that is attractive for Justin, ABSA, and ECIC? It's a matter of, three stuff, things that we don't need money for. How do we attract the financiers? We know that some of the policies, third-party access, is budget positive. We don't need money from the state. We're actually begging the state to give them money. But the most important one, and I think that is of interest to the likes of financiers, the banks, ECIC, is something called the Luxembourg Rail Protocol to the Cape Town Convention. So this came about at a diplomatic conference in Luxembourg in around 2007, sponsored jointly by UNIDROIT and OTIF, and attended by various member states, about 42. So the protocol is on international interest in mobile equipment, was adopted, creating a new worldwide legal framework to recognize and regulate security interest of lenders, lessors, and vendors selling under conditional sale agreements, where each are secured by rolling stock. So when we have third-party access, Justin has funded company A on this particular asset, and then it has to do a cross-border movement. Justin needs to know that if party A defaults, ABSA can go into Zimbabwe, Mozambique, anywhere else, then they'll be able to repossess. So those are free, practical policies that we can put in place to open up the market of financing, make the market more attractive. Looking onto the continent, South Africa is not the only country that should be ratifying the Luxembourg Rail Protocol, but the entire continent should, because we don't have money as a continent. Post-COVID, we actually worse off, because most of our money went into addressing our immediate needs at the particular time. So we are at a stage where we need policy intervention to open up the market, to grow the economy, to create the jobs that we want. And basically, we agree with the African Union that the development of the continent must rely on the potential offered by Africans, particularly its women and youth. So I will pack it right there for now.
Okay, you're not off the hook just yet. There's a few follow-up questions that I wanted to ask. So just bringing it back to the manufacturing discussion, you mentioned that there's potentially 45 billion rands worth of rolling stock that could be manufactured. In your opinion, how far off are we from this being realized? That's the first question. So how far away do you think we are from this opportunity being unlocked?
Can I give you a legal answer?
No, give us an honest answer.
It depends. So when the president made the pronouncement on third-party access, there was an expectation that this will be implemented in 12 months. So 12 months has come and 12 months is gone. So the implementation of this is purely up to government. And we have set up, or rather identified ourselves as a implementing agency for government's plans. Government has a lot of plans in place, including the different master plans, but somebody needs to action. We also need to make sure that whatever plans that will eventually be rolled out are business friendly. So being part of the decision making, influencing what actually is structured and is in those plans, government and business has to be actively involved. Talking past each other, government and private sector, that thing must come to an end. We have to be in a marriage, and it will not be a marriage of convenience. So in terms of manufacturing, to unlock the 45 billion rands for manufacturing strictly is all up to government. How do we know that? We know that because when government announced third-party access, we have multinational companies that are knocking on our doors. We have one South African company that has already put the money on the table that I'm putting my money, 17 billion rands over the period of 5 years if I get third-party access. So we know that there is commitment. We're not talking about, it's not theory, it's and hence we call it practical implementation. The only thing we need is government to give instructions to Transnet to open up the core network and allow private sector to access the rail core network. Then we would have your Exxaro not complaining that Transnet is costing us lots of money, we're making losses, and various mining houses have highlighted that the service has become unreliable, and we need to have a conversation about how we can resolve this. And as a matter of fact, Exxaro has gone out onto the market for an RFI looking to private sector to assist them in order to transport coal from their Grootegeluk mine into the Richards Bay. So we have locomotives immediately to step in and assist Transnet and Exxaro. And that does not necessarily only benefit the railway sector, but the entire economy. If 9 billion rands is lost by Exxaro, can we imagine if that loss is not a loss, but is actually transferred onto the economy because of the domino effect of having South African companies participating in providing solutions for our problems as a country.
Okay, thanks. Just to maybe follow up on that kind of rolling stock manufacturing. Do you think we have the capacity, if this comes into play, do we have the capacity to manufacture? And maybe do you have any comments around, so if you are in an SMME listening to this, are the opportunities in the kind of value chain of this potential new rolling stock manufacturing market, and how do we kind of engage with that?
Okay, this is the most exciting part, because there are people that think that we don't have capacity, we don't have skills, and I don't know how they define that. But definitely we have capacity. We still have a number of companies that still manufacture your wagons, and some of the OEMs actually are manufacturing locomotives, or at least some parts in South Africa. So we do have the capacity. We have Gibela that is currently manufacturing in the country, but in order to have a Gibela train, you need suppliers within the industry to manufacture. So we have the skills, we have the capacity to manufacture. Now, how soon can we manufacture? the companies that are in place currently are surviving because of the export market, but we prefer to manufacture and supply here at home and looking into the continent. And also drawing on the African Union resolution in 2015 that says South Africa will be the hub of rail rolling stock manufacturing. So we have everything around us. It's a matter of having the sector open up from a policy point of view, because the industry is ready, is willing, and is able to respond to third-party access and the needs that are required by South Africa and the rest of the continent.
Great. And just while this is a great discussion. Do you think third-party access will also open up further demand for rail? So if we kind of look at the broader kind of transport sector, do you think there would be a shift from road to rail as a result of opening it up to third-party access? And will that in effect kind of create further knock-on effects for manufacturing?
Absolutely. And this is also quite exciting as well. So with our research, we have identified that the general freight business, there is underutilization of the network. We have about, say, 70% of that network that is currently not being utilized. There are other lines, for instance, the Oryx line from Saldanha into the port, the coal line. Those are almost at maximum capacity, where and are fairly serviced by Transnet. But where there is a market, this is where we can come in. Currently, the general freight business, 17% is moved by rail, whereas the remainder is moved by road. So that we can have a complete, or perhaps even freight that moves by rail, but there are certain requirements that business wants to have: reliability, want to deliver to my customers on time, I need to make profits and pay off ABSA for the loan that they have provided to me. But whilst we're looking at not only benefiting the railway sector, but government on its own will then have less money to maintain the road, and that will be key. I have driven on the N3 lately. It's a nightmare, and the reason that is a nightmare is because we are not servicing certain industries. How do we know that? We have interacted with Agri SA. They were asked if they can buy their own rolling stock, and they said, look, we are in the business of grains and all that. We will not be purchasing rolling stock for ourselves. We want rail companies to come in and provide logistics support. We also working with the likes of BUSA. We expect that in the next week or so, there will a public statement that will be made that they support third-party access, and they will actively promote third-party access as well. We have met with Forestry Association, where the members gave us a detailed numbers, because we work numbers, that I have 70% of my cargo moving by road today. I can completely move that 70% on rail. So this is where the numbers come from. Now, the forestry market, the rolling stock, the wagons, are a little bit outdated. So if we were to unlock the third-party access, immediately we start manufacturing. Immediately an SMME, part of the rural development of which, rural economy development of which is a policy for government, then there is rail running there. There is work for the locals and not necessarily manufacturing capacity in the country. You start opening up the congested Durban port. So it's not only about the manufacturing, but the ripple effect that it has on the economy. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that Mr. President, as he promised us, maybe can deliver as soon as possible.
Great. I think, Justin, did you have a comment on what Marcela has been saying?
So I think having kind of looked at what happened with privatization in the energy sector, so to bring it back home to manufacturers, we've been waiting for quite a while for the Energy Regulatory Act. Marcela was talking about like working with business. I think what's also important in all of this policy is that it's clear and that it's simple, because then you allow private sector to invest in it and bankers to finance, because there's no kind of gray area in all that policy. And we just know what a legal solar installation is versus what's not legal. And I think that's key, that we make the policy, we make it simple. And then private sector, as we've seen in the solar market, a lot of manufacturers then saying, well, there's a lack of energy supply. I'm enabled, I can write it off for tax purposes in year one. So I can start producing my own power, put batteries in, and kind of take on some of this infrastructure investment. I think we also saw the investment or the announcement recently about REAP, the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. That was also one of these that, after a long hiatus, now we've got that program back up and running. And I think why that one's important, like the rail discussion, like the harbors, is that all this infrastructure lasts for decades. We need the infrastructure to grow the economy. So the pie is not necessarily, we're not eating the same, we're growing that pie. So it all goes hand in hand. But I think, just creating the certainty and then keeping that demand constant, not starting these programs, because I think for local manufacturers and local business, one, we need the infrastructure so that we can grow. But then number two, so that there is the constant demand. It's not just 1 year and then that manufacturer, that community is not seeing the benefits consistently. So I think that's the only thing I wanted to add, that, it takes a long time, but we're seeing these green shoots. And I think now we just need to keep that momentum going, and hopefully you do get good news, Stella.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I think that's a really valuable comment, particularly around, I guess it's around market certainty. And if we want to create new market opportunities for manufacturing, we need that kind of policy certainty space to ensure that, not like what happened with the REAP, but that there's kind of long-term market possibilities for people to invest in, and obviously that's linked back to the financing opportunities. So I'm now going to change track a little bit, and I know Melicia's been waiting patiently there in the corner, and just maybe talk a bit about kind of a new up-and-coming kind of sector in the finance space, and that's sustainable finance or green finance. So we know that COP26 is currently underway. We know all the key challenges that are being presented around climate change, and that manufacturers and companies really need to start repositioning themselves for kind of a new space around green legislation and accounting for carbon in the operations, and really kind of driving, a key thing around green and sustainability is efficiency, and it kind of goes hand in hand. So my question to you, Melicia, from NCPC is, how should manufacturers be positioning themselves to kind of be well suited for the kind of up and coming green finance landscape? So we know that, and maybe Justin can come in later, but banks are also going to be coming under increasing pressure to kind of have a large portion of their portfolio looking at sustainable and green projects. So if you are a manufacturer, what are the current opportunities that you could take advantage of in the green space, and what kind of projects or efficiency measures should manufacturers be looking at to position themselves for a green finance landscape? If you have any comments on that, Melicia.
Okay, thanks, Liesl. I think first I'd maybe like to give a little bit of background because we've pretty much been doing this work for about 10 years now in the Industrial Energy Efficiency Project. And so the Industrial Energy Efficiency Project is the international project of the NCPC. And we effectively assist manufacturers to become more competitive through the deployment of industrial energy efficiency. So in the form of systems optimization, where you look at the entire system holistically, as well as energy management system. But I think, you know, as much as manufacturers have been embracing the benefits of this approach for a while now, there are still some manufacturers who do not fully grasp the missed opportunity here, especially in terms of the fact that you know, the transition to cleaner and greener production and becoming more energy efficient and more resource efficient, or adapting to clean energy in itself can actually fund you know, future business improvements and growth and expansion of their companies. So, you know, in addition to the compelling business case that the transition to green obviously provides in terms of profitability and other core benefits that come with it, there's this obvious national call to action now in terms of you know, being able to reach targets that have been committed to internationally, and that's driving and catalyzing the transformation financial mechanisms for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Pretty much on the incentive side, I think we've definitely seen a lot of benefit to manufacturers come from national government incentives and grants. Just on the flip side of that, we obviously have the sort of independent alternative investment companies that focus more on enterprise development holistically, but obviously clean finance and you know, things like clean energy are an extension of that now. But on the incentives and the grant side, there's quite a lot to go through, and you know, the ones that we've assisted companies with through our program, and just helping them to walk that sustainability journey and transition to a lower carbon footprint, but also a more competitive environment where they're able to compete in a global space, because it really does build a more resilient and sustainable manufacturing company in the long term. But in terms of the three that we've seen really come to the fore, I think you know, on the government grants and incentive side, it's definitely the sector-specific programs. So, for instance, the agro-processing, automotive, clothing, and textile sectors all have their independent programs, you know, that are aligned to the challenges in the sector and the needs of the sector. And while these incentives periodically change, and now they've been sort of realigned to the master plan deliverables and targets for the respective sectors over the next 5 years, they have been of great benefit to companies. So, you know, we've worked with companies that have been able to really benefit lucratively from these incentives and pretty much fund the entire solar PV plant. So, you know, whether that's done in phases of the installation and they manage to fund an entire phase, that's still a huge benefit to them. And these grants and incentives, they usually work on like a refund basis. So you either paying back full amount of the project costs have been covered by the company, or alternatively, if it's not paid back in full, it would be in part or on a sliding scale. So the company should be able to put up those costs upfront and be prepared to receive the refund in time to come. The second one, which has been, quite beneficial and possibly one of the most successful incentives in South Africa, has been the 12L energy efficiency tax incentive. And we worked with this one quite a lot together with Sanedi as a technical advisory. But in terms of manufacturers having benefited from this incentive, I think, there are a couple of driving forces behind this. So linked to lower operating costs, but also in terms of the carbon taxes. So obviously becoming more energy efficient serves the company well in terms of paying less on their carbon tax if they are direct emitters. The 12L tax incentive has been extended because of the success of the incentive itself, and they've managed to deliver almost 22 billion rand in tax savings. So it's pretty much a tax rebate program, where companies have to be able to measure and verify the savings that they make on their energy efficiency projects. And in the next tax year, they would receive a tax deduction of 95 cents per kilowatt hour of energy saved. So that's been really quite lucrative as well for companies. I mean, they've pretty much benefited across 14 different sectors of the economy, and it covers all of the energy carriers from electricity to jet fuel. And then the one that has really been gaining popularity as more of a financial instrument is probably, on the carbon offsets or credit side. And this is pretty much also underpinned by the carbon tax and the penalties that manufacturers have been facing. Now, obviously, the carbon offsets are a tradable commodity, and this can either be from the company itself, obviously outside of the taxable activities, or alternatively, from a third party, as long as the projects are registered by an accredited, standard. And there's currently 3 standards that they can choose to be accredited with. But pretty much, in terms of the carbon tax, that's priced currently at 134 Rand per ton of CO2 for the direct emitters. And that's set to increase by about 10% each year over the next 5 years, or they were talking something like inflation plus 2%. But in terms of providing a significant saving for large emitters, the carbon offsets have actually managed to help them quite significantly. But the dual benefit is it also seeks to incentivize the emission of or the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by the sectors that are not covered in the carbon tax. So in order for them to actually lower their emissions so that they can sell off these credits, as well as the fact that they are not covered under incentives, or they don't manage to benefit from incentives like else. So for example, the transport sector, agricultural, land use and forestry sector, as well as the waste sector, which generally presents a lot of opportunity in terms of energy savings. So those are the main sort of incentives that we've seen help manufacturers grow and expand, over the last few years.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Just a follow up on that. Have you seen much uptake? I think it's the 12B tax incentive as well, or maybe you or Justin could comment on this. So this is particularly around manufacturers who want to invest in renewable energy technologies. I think they, from a tax perspective, allowed to depreciate the full value of that investment in year 1. Is this something that's manufacturers are considering together with the 12L?
Yes, so in our projects that we've worked on, where we looked at the financial feasibility of the installation of solar PV, companies have definitely benefited from that incentive. We've costed it into our financial models, which obviously significantly reduce the cost of the project or improve the payback on the project. Yeah, I don't know if Justin has any particular things that he's seen in his field that he can add.
Yes, maybe just on 12B, we see clients use it, but the business case isn't dependent on it anymore. So break-evens for something like solar, direct Eskom clients, we're seeing 12-year break-even. Some of those are now seeing 5 years. Municipal clients, we're seeing 2-year paybacks on solar installations, which are 20-year assets. So you don't even need that write down. But yeah, businesses are using it. I think in good times, what we've seen in the agricultural market this year, there were good or decent profits. So it spurred on some investment where you say, well, I can invest in infrastructure and then get the tax write-off. It would need to be less than a megawatt. If it's bigger, it's bigger than a megawatt, it would be 50, 30, 20. So we're hoping that in time with these new regulations, the upping of the 1 megawatt cap for registration, hopefully then the Treasury says, well, you can write all those installations off in year 1. And I think what's interesting for me is that, for all the negative news around renewables in the past, I mean, the government's always supported it through this tax incentive, and businesses, we tell all our clients that you get the tax benefit. So we've seen the support through the years, just through Treasury and giving this incentive.
Before you go back on mute, maybe just sticking on the sustainable finance topic, we know that I think last year National Treasury released a sustainable finance white paper, which is really around the banking sector and looking at banking investments, equity, pension funds and the like, and kind of introducing sustainability targets into the portfolios that banks fund. From the work that you're involved in, are you finding that it's kind of something that's being pushed from the finance side, and do you think it will filter down onto manufacturers? So are you as a bank going to be looking more at manufacturers who are positioning themselves around green projects?
So number one, our solar targets are in the board deck, so they're available. So you can see my team's targets for the year in the market anyway. I think also, likewise, our colleagues in the investment bank have made commitments to funding of renewable energy. We were also, across the group, there's a lot of us that have sustainability at the core of all our strategies. So we were involved in the coal standard. Recently, we've worked on an oil and gas standard, and you'll see more of our sectors bringing in these sustainability standards. So saying, how do we, so my view on all of this is it's not all about kind of saying, you are an emitter. We know manufacturers are heavy energy users, but how do we support that journey into being more energy efficient and emitting or consuming less energy through the process? So it is core. In terms of manufacturing, so the 3 sectors me and my team look at, sustainability is a core pillar of every single one of those strategies. With manufacturers, what's been interesting, Alicia, we've known and worked with the NCPC for years, but that energy efficiency journey has been a difficult one to sell, but it's the quickest energy saving. And for us, it's a core pillar in our strategy as well, because you can just, as an example, you can look at your energy bill and make savings on your tariff. Then you can go and look at your motors, you can look at all these energy efficiency measures and save money. So if we ignored sustainability, we would also be ignoring a very good business case. And I think it is more tangible to businesses now with energy costs skyrocketing, going up 15% last year, they'll go up again next year. possibly at that rate again. And it does make it kind of, if you want to be competitive, you have to look at your energy costs. Maybe the last point is that we also see, to the point Felicia made, that if you're exporting, globally, you need to look at these things, and you need to look at your sustainability. And more corporates are going to be saying to their supply chains, well, what are you doing in terms of sustainability? So I think, number one, it's good business practice, and the investment case makes sense, so you should do it anyway. The banks are willing to fund. There's a lot of grants available. There's tax write-offs. So I think it's easy to embrace now compared to 5 years ago.
I think, that's actually great, because that's a next question I wanted to ask, and it was something that Marcela prompted around: is Africa ready for the green economy? And I think if we maybe take the discussion back to the export focus, kind of what we're seeing coming out of the EU is pretty stringent legislation around number one, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which is going to kind of force companies to account for their carbon across the entire value chain of production. So from source to the time it reaches the EU border. And similarly, they're looking at things in agriculture around what they're calling farm to fork, which is really also around production and companies kind of accounting for carbon in their value chain and in their processes. Maybe a question back to Sindiso around the ECIC. Have you seen trends in this regard? And are exporters actually ready for this new kind of landscape that's coming our way?
I think on our side, because we work extensively with the banks, so I can say that even though we might not be, directly involved in some of these processes, however, from the perspective that if a bank would not consider any projects, if we are using as an example, if there is high emissions and the project obviously has to be funded by a bank, if that does not qualify for bank funding, it means generally the rule is that it will not be eligible, for ECA covered financing. However, just from an EC Export Credit Agency perspective, I think we've also seen a shift, because a lot of the ECAs actually do come from, the developed world. So advanced economies are obviously pushing that agenda, and we have already seen some of the ECAs taking a standpoint in terms of supporting such kind of transactions. But I think the general rule for us is that something has to have bank support, in order for it to be eligible for ECIC support, because we do not finance at this point in time. I see. Marcela is asking.
Marcela is ready to take you on. So Marcela, you want to voice your views here? Don't forget you're on mute.
I come from a nuts and bolts environment where I can see on a day-to-day basis what would work, what would not work, and the impact, or rather what is being dictated to as Africans. For instance, the member states that are setting standards for emissions and a different number of things. Now, my question is Africa ready for this shift? And I don't think we are. And if we are not, and then we have to meet certain targets, it will not be Africans that will benefit from those targets. And that is my concern. I am an African through and through, and if there is anything that needs to be done business-wise or otherwise that does not benefit Africans, for me, it's off the table to be discussed. You look at the energy side. There's a complaint. They say they're going to cease using coal to generate electricity. It's it's a strange thing because that coal has actually created a demand for countries that have stopped using coal as a source of energy. So the likes of Germany actually have a very high demand. They're looking for ash, which they will use for their cement to get like different grades of cement. So whilst we are being asked that you need to meet this, but are we ready for it? Is our economy ready for it? Is it this standards? Is it Africa friendly? Would it make any difference to a normal South African in Lusigisigi? Or it's a policy that comes with from different states, depending who has more power. And in my view, we as Africa, we're not ready to comply with those things. Eventually, yes, we can't compete with the Europeans that have set their standards that on a certain level in terms of manufacturing, and we say, no, we want to be in that level. And if we do that, how do we leapfrog from being at 5 to being at 100? My view is that it's only those that are pushing the agenda that will benefit. We also talk about standards. Whose standards? Really, whose standards? In the rail sector, we have a company that manufactures wheels that you find on the train. They have to spend 1.1 million to get the certification to be accredited. Now, before, as a South African manufacturing company, before I cough, I need to spend that money. Now, tell me where the SMME is going to get that money. And actually, these standards are used as a barrier to entry into the different member states. Those are precisely dictating the agenda for energy today. Yes, we want sustainable development for the country, but we need to define that for ourselves as Africans. On the banking side, they say Africa is risky and all that. Isn't it time that we redefine risk for Africa? I mean, African Bank, that's what they're looking at, saying that, the risk elsewhere and the risk in Africa is not the same. What measures can we put in place? For instance, with the Luxembourg protocol, you use the legal framework to make the environment more friendly. Rail is like 1% of the emissions worldwide, but we're going to continue on diesel in South Africa for a long time because of the infrastructure. They may or may not have been vandalized, but the pandemic has taught us one thing. We need to use what we have in order for us to grow as an economy. Somebody mentioned earlier on that there was repurposing of raw material. And it's not the first time this is happening. Even during your world wars, where a certain company in Germany was manufacturing the uniforms for soldiers, once the war came to an end, they repurposed that factory and they started manufacturing filter bags for the energy industry where coal is concerned. But those are my views on regarding the continent. We cannot engage in anything that does not protect the interest of Africans, and I hold a very firm view on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcella. I think you've kind of raised that there's definitely political economy kind of discussions around all these topics. I think one thing that we need to keep in mind, how I always like to think about it, is relevance. And how, as Africa, do we remain relevant in the global kind of landscape? And I think, in a lot of these kind of discussions and where we're seeing sustainability and the likes heading, often it feels like we don't really have a choice, because when it becomes legislation, how do we actually remain relevant to where kind of the global standards are moving? So I think I think we all Africanists at heart, and so how do we kind of balance this kind of global landscape and remaining relevant as a continent? I'm mindful that we are kind of reaching our time limits, so if anyone has any final comments or pearls of wisdom that they'd like to share on how do we kind of position finance for manufacturers in the future, I will open it up to any final comments now. Otherwise, we'll close the session.
Thank you, Lizzo. From my side, I'll obviously take this in twofold. I think the first part will be to try and answer Ms. Zille in terms of, I think for us in particular as an ECA, sometimes it becomes very hard because, like she's saying, you have international standards. If we look at, say, projects that we have done in Mozambique, where we've participated with other export credit agencies, if you're looking at a $1 billion project and funding is coming from different sources, unfortunately, you generally have to comply to a single level in terms of how the whole project works. I think under those circumstances, it's very different. Unlike if we are funding on our own and we can follow local rules and standards. So I think on our side, that are some of the challenges that we have. So whether from an African perspective we're ready or not, or whether we can be dictated to, unfortunately, at some of the levels, it becomes very difficult to set our own standards in terms of what must be complied with when you're working with institutions from 8 different countries, and you sort of like have to have a level playing field and the platform in terms of how things are assessed. So I do acknowledge, and I hear her sentiments in terms of, and it's very, very frustrating, I must acknowledge, but there are those circumstances where we have to be pushed into the corner, and we end up having to comply with some of these rules. I think on my side, just my closing remarks, I think the discussion has indeed been very insightful, and I'm happy to see that our rail sector is addressing some of these issues, because when we have these engagements with manufacturers, transport costs are one of the highest inhibiting factors, and they have expressed similar frustration in terms of rail being the most cost effective, but efficiencies are actually very low in that sector. I think as part of our research this year, we've been engaging some of the guys in the plastic sector. Same thing, they complain that the cost of transporting from Joburg to Durban by road is more expensive than someone shipping from China, for collection in Durban. So if we do have our rail infrastructure being efficient and operating, I think from ECIC, we've supported quite a number of leases, DRC, Zimbabwe, where they were transporting minerals in particular, and those projects have generally worked very, very well. So I think we do need an ecosystem that works, from whether we're talking energy or whether we're talking transportation or even innovations for that matter, so that our manufacturing sector is competitive. If we're looking at all-in costs in terms of, the final output that we have, I think the onus is not just on the financiers, on the innovators, on the industry experts, but even government bringing in the necessary support so that we have a manufacturing sector that can compete. We have a manufacturing sector that has good stead, in the African continental free trade area and people are trading. We don't want to be running back to government crying about anti-dumping rules. So we need to make sure that we're well positioned to compete. We can compete efficiently, we're producing quality products, at affordable prices, so that we can export to the rest of the continent products that are competitive and that are quality. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sindiso. Any other final comments from the panelists? Melissa.
Okay, so response to Zille's comments, I think, we obviously have to take the approach that Africa is quite different from the other continents. But we also have to be mindful that there's a lot that we don't know, and we have to learn from others that have gone before. So as much as we need to tailor make the solutions for Africa, there is a growing environmental regulatory landscape, in addition to the very vast and complex landscape that we have already set up, over the last 20 years. But, in saying that, that's being done in Africa in getting those goals and providing support and assistance. And our program is a perfect example of that. The Industrial Energy Efficiency Project is a global project. And it's one that's being implemented in many developing countries around the world. I think there's about 18 at the moment. But ours has been the most successful by far, and so much so that we are the only country to have received a second bout of funding for that project. And that's really because we were so successful at implementing and entrenching the first phase and really introducing the concepts and the methodologies of energy efficiency through the optimization techniques and the energy management systems. When it comes to the standard side of things, we have to describe to what the global community is doing in terms of international standards. So ISO 50001 is an example of that. It's an international energy management standard which has significantly taken off in Europe, and that's largely due to the government incentivizing companies to become ISO 50001 certified. So in that sense, it's a way for us to go, and there's a long way for us to go in terms of being able to afford to put out those sort of incentives, and for the drive to be strong enough, both from the manufacturing sector as well as from a policy side of things. So, I just wanted to give some comment to that. Thanks.
Thanks, Felicia. Am I seeing you, Stella?
Yes. Look, for me, in close, I'd like to maybe address some of the comments made for Justin, for instance, the steel manufacturing sector. Those that you fund locally and those that you fund locally that do business with government, they have unfair business clauses in their contracts. For an example, I can have a 15 billion rand contract with Transnet that actually is worth zero. So there'll be a clause that says as and when. So is it an asset? Will that contract be an asset, not an asset? Is it there? Is it not really there? So those are some of the things that as a funder that you need to be quite aware of. Because once somebody says as and when, I still need to go and queue somewhere to buy the raw material. And if my order is below minimum quantity, then our manufacturing sector dies. So I think as a funder, you need to be aware of this. The innovation we've covered already. But when on the manufacturing side, I went to a higher learning education where we had those guys that I didn't like, the engineers. Then they used to go for in-service training. During their in-service training, they earned money. So when they came back to school, they had more money than everybody else. So that's why we didn't like them. But what is important was that you have a manufacturer, you have a manufacturing hub that is able to bring in a chemical engineer, mechanical engineer, electrical engineer to offer them in-service training. So if we don't manufacture, we are actually compromising our skills, what goes out. So you have an engineer that does not necessarily have an experience to be in the jobs that need to be in because we don't have a manufacturing sector. So we need to have it for that purposes as well. And on the ECIC side, Cindy, I think some of the rules around what you can cover and not cover, we are actually shooting ourselves in the foot. You compete with other internationals, companies, where your rule says there must be South African local content. How do you then compete? You know, and what if the South African local content is actually not there? So I think some of the rules we need to be, a bit flexible, not to prescribe to business, particularly on the export side. Melisha, you talk about incentives and grants. I think if there's anyone in business that has applied for a grant and incentive, they will tell you they can write a book about accessing those funds and how long it takes. And that administrative process on its own kills business. And I need to, when we talk about the bolts and nuts of the manufacturing sector, those are some of the important things that we should know. You have all these fancy incentives, but they don't work. Okay, and the standards issue, it's important. We can't negotiate that. Africa will forever be excluded because of this standard. There'll be standards that will be imposed on us. It's either we develop an African standard and not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but taking the best out of the standards that are available elsewhere. The Americans, they have their own standards. The Europeans have their own standards. The Chinese, they have their own standards. And actually, the famous 1064 Transnet project, it is precisely those standards that were used to exclude the local companies, even though it was South African money that was used to fund the program. So standards cannot be negotiable. It must comply and it must benefit South Africans. In closing, where railroads go, jobs follow. Businesses are able to be sustainable and provides opportunities. The gates open wide. And I will say thank you to Manufacturing Endeavour to have provided me with this opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcella, and thanks for your passion. Justin, any final comments?
Yeah. So we do look at those contracts and we do look at the clauses, and I think that's an important thing that we've seen in other sectors that don't just chase contracts, understand what you're getting into, understand what the prices are, because it can work both ways. But we met a manufacturer last week that was telling us that government is best payer compared to corporate. So it's not always, there's a lot of road, but I think it's also not always the case that they should be seen as the bad guy. I think what's important for me is that let's drive the infrastructure that'll drive demand. I think to the point on energy, we've got to be practical about all of this. We've got to create jobs. With our biggest kind of handbrake as an economy has been the lack of energy. If you had energy, if you had access to finance, the economy will grow. We've struggled with our infrastructure, whether it's energy or transporting goods. So I think if we just get all of that going and we are seeing the green shoots there, then demand will grow. And I think compared to kind of the global financial crisis, what we've gone through in this crisis, there is access to liquidity and there is funding. So hopefully with that demand, that drives business and the funders are there to finance business. So we are optimistic. We're seeing kind of the master plans. We're seeing the right movements. It might be a tough kind of 12, 24 months, but we do think we're on the right path to kind of not see those declines you spoke about, Liesl. We've seen the bounce back in manufacturing, but what we really want to see now is growth. We want to see energy available so you can manufacture the goods. And I think to the point on standards, we have some of the best manufacturers in the world. So, not to say that we can't see more of those on the continent and kind of grow excellent businesses. Thanks to everyone.
Thanks. Thank you, Justin. And from my side, I just wanted to say thank you to all the panelists. I think we've had some really good discussion and good debate. So I thank you for bringing your expertise and your passion to the panel. And I think just listening to everything that's been said today from my side, I think we've kind of seen that finance is critical, but we also maybe need to take a bit of a more systems view approach if we're really wanting to ensure that manufacturing remains competitive, because I think a lot of the discussion has revealed that we need policy, we need critical infrastructure, and we need to position ourselves for the kind of coming legislative changes around green and sustainability. So yes, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to the Manufacturing Indaba, and we will call it a day there.